Welcome to the Green Urbanist, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Yes, welcome back to the podcast. It's been several weeks since the last episode, but the podcast is still very much ongoing. Just needed to take a break to deal with, life outside of the podcast. Hope you've all had a good Christmas. If you're someone in a part of the world that celebrates Christmas, and a Happy New Year into 2021. As you know, as you can probably guess from the title of this episode, we're not really talking about cities this week. We're talking about food and agriculture and land use. As you probably know by now, if you've listened to previous episodes, this podcast is called The Green Urbanist, but we don't just talk about cities. We talk about sustainability topics broadly, and that includes, the use of the countryside, the use of rural land, and all the complexity involved with climate change. In this episode, I'm broaching a pretty controversial and touchy subject, which is the meat industry. I'm going to throw in a caveat right now that this episode isn't about picking sides in an argument or criticizing anyone's diet or moral standpoint. I'm not going to be talking about nutrition or anything like that. It's just not my place. But that being said, you may find aspects of this episode challenging. Some of you listening may be vegetarian or vegan. Some of you may eat a lot of meat and not really think twice about it. I think any people in either of those groups will likely be challenged in some way by today's episode. So I really don't expect to have many listeners left after this. I'm probably going to offend everybody. But I just hope that you can get something from this that will deepen your understanding of what is a very complex issue. This podcast is all about taking topics around sustainability and climate change and saying, actually, this is a bit more complicated than you might think, and taking a deep dive into the science. And that's exactly what we're doing in today's episode. So I'll tell you the fundamental premise of the argument up front, and then we can get into all the details. The premise of today's episode is that the way we currently produce most of our meat, using factory farms and feedlots, is a disaster from an environmental point of view, and contributes a small but significant amount to global greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change. However, there is a potential solution to this problem beyond simply eating less meat, which involves managing livestock in such a way that it contributes to ecosystem restoration and carbon sequestration in soil. That's why the title of this episode is Why Cows Aren't Necessarily Evil. I should say now that none of the ideas I'm putting forward here are my own. They all come from research and from reading about what other people are doing. Of course, all the references are in the podcast description if you want to do some more reading. Another thing to mention is that I use a small number of examples in this episode. In reality, there are a lot of people doing work in this space and using similar approaches, sometimes using different names in lots of different places throughout the world. So although it is still a very niche topic, it is actually much broader maybe than just the few examples I use in today's episode. So just bear that in mind. I didn't want to bore you by just bringing up lots and lots of people who are doing the same thing. A quick note maybe before we get into it. I use the term, I assume people who are listening to this episode have a pretty good, basic understanding of climate change, about greenhouse gas emissions, carbon, methane, all these, fundamental things. I use the term carbon sequestration a lot. Sequestration basically means storing carbon. And indeed, when we say carbon sequestration, it's not just carbon dioxide, it can also be other greenhouse gases, such as methane. And I'll discuss a bit more about that. But just as a heads up, when we say carbon sequestration in soils, what we mean is taking greenhouse gases and absorbing them into soil and basically trapping them there so they're no longer in the atmosphere. Everyone is talking about carbon sequestration in different forms as being a really, really key part of how we're going to tackle climate change. There are, of course, many different ways of carbon sequestration. The one you're probably thinking of is trees and forests, which are store carbon. Well, trees make use of carbon to grow, so they store the carbon in their in their woody material. But also soils are really, really good carbon sinks. The ocean is a huge carbon sink. So there's lots of different, any sort of plant material is a form of carbon sequestration. So just so we're all on the same page, let's get into the topic. So we've all been told that one of the leading causes of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change is livestock farming, in particular cows. And the only way to solve this problem is if we all eat less meat. Or if we do eat meat, at least don't eat beef, because cows are the worst offenders. And reducing our global meat consumption will go a long way to tackling climate change, we're told. And when we're told to eat less meat, this is a simple, very strong, simple message. Indeed, it's a simple solution to an incredibly complex problem, which I think is why it's become so widely spread. I've been doing a lot of reading on this subject lately, and I just want to bring some fresh thinking into this topic so we can understand that it's maybe not as simple as all that. So why is livestock farming so harmful to the environment? There are lots of figures floating around about what percentage of global emissions are caused by livestock, with some people claiming that the industry is responsible for 50% of the world's emissions and is even worse than the transport sector. If you actually go deeper and read the scientific literature, you find that these figures have actually been discredited and are simply not true. They stem from a misrepresentation of calculations on global emissions and have been repeated over and over by the media. As the baseline for this episode, I'm using a source that I think we can all agree is fairly reputable, which is the United Nations. And according to a report by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations from 2013 called Tackling Climate Change Through Livestock, the livestock sector represents 14.5% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, with beef and cattle milk comprising over half of these emissions. Let's just stop here and put this figure into perspective. So 14.5% of all global emissions is a lot. But it's nowhere near the overblown figures that are sometimes quoted in the media, and is definitely lower than the two big contributors, which are the energy and transport sectors. So it's important to put that in perspective. Let's go back to this figure, 14.5%. What is actually involved in this? I mean, where are these emissions coming from? What are the components of the livestock industry that contribute to these emissions? Now, I'm going to hit you with a lot of figures here, so I apologize in advance, but it is necessary to understand where these emissions are coming from. A full 45% of all these emissions, almost half, is due to what the report calls feed production and processing. Okay, what does that mean? I mean, if you grew up in the west of Ireland like I did, you probably think that cows just eat grass, which grows naturally in fields. How could this account for almost half of emissions? There's no fossil fuel inputs here. The reason is because most cows in the world are not allowed to roam large fields and graze naturally on grass, the food they evolved to be experts in digesting. In fact, they are kept in what's called factory farms or feedlots. Essentially, they're kept in confined spaces and fed crops like wheat and corn. It's worth saying that these are not the foods that cows evolved to eat, and it can actually make them very sick. It's also highly inefficient because you need other land to grow these crops, which is grown with fertilizers that release nitrous oxide. The crops are harvested with large machinery and transported to cattle farms. What's more, when you plough land to grow crops, that releases carbon that's been stored in the soil. Soil is a huge carbon sink, just like trees. This is something I'll talk about more later in the episode. So that's a big part of where these carbon emissions are coming from. We're releasing emissions to grow food, to feed cows that they don't even naturally eat. It's hugely inefficient. What's more, in some parts of the world like Brazil, they're chopping down rainforest to convert land to cattle farms, which is obviously a terrible idea, both in terms of emissions and habitat destruction. A further 10% of emissions relating to livestock is due to what's referred to as manure storage and processing. Yes, I'm really talking about manure. You see, when lots of cows are kept in a confined space, they produce a lot of waste. This results in literal rivers or lagoons of manure that have to be stored and then safely disposed of. Now, when this isn't allowed to basically, be absorbed back into nature, this releases methane and nitrous oxide, two very potent greenhouse gas emissions. It can also have terrible local environmental and public health impacts. Manure releases gases that are harmful to human health. If this manure gets into rivers through illegal dumping or because of flooding, it essentially poisons the river's ecosystem, killing fish and spreading pathogens. About another 9% of emissions come from processing milk and meat and the transportation of products. The final part of this emissions puzzle is a whopping 39% of the sector's greenhouse gas emissions from what scientists call enteric fermentation from ruminants, or what you probably know as cow farts, which release methane. Now, they are actually cow burps, not farts, by the way. You may not think that's an important distinction, but while we're on the topic, we might as well get it right. Methane is a huge topic, so I want to address this right now. The media has taken hold of this point about methane emissions from livestock and blown it up to seem like it is one of the major causes of climate change. You've probably heard that methane causes 20 times more warming than carbon dioxide. This is technically true on the molecular level because molecules of methane absorb heat to a much greater degree than carbon dioxide, but methane is far less abundant than CO2, and it only stays in the atmosphere for about 10 years. Compare this to carbon dioxide, which can hang around for 1,000 years. It is estimated that methane is responsible for about 20% of the effects of climate change. So make no mistake, carbon dioxide is very much the major driver of climate change, not methane. Cows and other ruminants naturally emit methane as part of their digestive process. They've been doing this for thousands of years, and they're not the only sources of methane. Methane occurs naturally in the atmosphere, emitted from non-human sources like wild animals, wetlands, volcanoes, and forest fires. These natural sources account for 40% of all the methane in the atmosphere, with human sources, also called anthropogenic sources, accounting for 60%. So obviously we've been pumping a lot more methane in the atmosphere than would naturally be there. Now, how does this break down? So the Global Methane Initiative estimates that enteric fermentation, cow burps, is responsible for 27% of anthropogenic methane sources, whereas fossil fuel extraction and processing is responsible for 33% of anthropogenic emissions, with the remainder being from municipal solid waste, wastewater, rice cultivation, actually surprisingly a big one, and other minor sources from agriculture and that kind of thing. To complicate things further, scientists admit that calculating sources of methane is incredibly difficult, and the figures are always under review. A study was released in early 2020 that suggests that human-caused emissions from methane from the extraction and use of fossil fuels may have been severely underestimated in previous studies. The implication is that methane emissions from fossil fuels are 25 to 40% higher than earlier estimates suggest. So what we're saying is that methane emitted from livestock is maybe 27% of the 60% of methane that is caused by humans, which itself only accounts for 20% of the effects of climate change. So when you consider it that way, the role of cow burps in our climate emergency appears incredibly minor. But let's move on to the main crux of the argument. How can we manage livestock better? So far you might be thinking that I'm not doing a very good job in defending cows, and that all of this sounds awful. And it is awful. You can see the wisdom in telling people just eat less beef, because if there's less of this going on in the world, that can only be a good thing. But the reason that livestock creates all of these problems is because we have taken them out of their natural environment and ecosystem and put them into these intensive feedlot farms. All of the greenhouse gas emissions that I've talked about here are byproducts of this method of intensively growing cattle for milk and meat. With the exception of methane, they aren't inherently caused by cows. So is it possible to have cows without all these negative effects? Is it possible even to make use of cows to have a positive effect on the environment? To answer this, let's take a step back and consider cows and livestock for what they are. They are animals who evolved within a particular environment and fulfill a particular niche. A DNA study from 2012 indicates that all modern European cattle are descended from as little as 80 wild ox, or aurochs, that were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent 10,500 years ago. These wild ox are now extinct, but we can look at their close relatives like bison and buffalo, or even to other large ruminants like deer, zebras, and wildebeest. All of these species form large herds comprised of hundreds, thousands, sometimes even millions of individuals. If these herds stayed in one place for long, they would quickly consume all the vegetation and leave a barren landscape behind. And this is where the balance of nature comes in. These herd animals are always at risk of being preyed upon by predators like big cats and wolves. In fact, that's why they form herds in the first place. You stand a much better chance of escaping a pack of lions if you're with 1,000 others than if you're alone. So a predator shows up and the entire herd moves away to find somewhere more peaceful to eat. We're all familiar with seeing this phenomenon on nature programs on TV. What many people don't appreciate is the important connection between this behavior and the health of the grasslands ecosystem. These grass-eating animals prune the mature vegetation, agitate the soil with their hooves, and leave lots of manure on the ground. And then they move on. Now the grasslands have a chance to recover, and the manure fertilizes the soil, giving it nutrients to grow fresh vegetation, until another herd shows up and the whole cycle begins again. This process actually locks away carbon in the soil, potentially for thousands of years, and contributes to soil health and ecosystem diversity. The amazing thing is that if there are too many herd animals without predators, they will overgraze and harm the ecosystem, even causing it to become a desert, which happens in equatorial parts of the world where land is overgrazed by livestock. When this happens, or the soil is tilled for crops, it releases carbon that has been stored in the soil. On the other hand, if there are too few animals, then the grass grows and grows until it dies and dries out, smothering the soil and preventing fresh growth from coming up, harming the ecosystem in another way. The vegetation, ruminants, and predators all evolved together, and so if you mess with one part of the balance, you harm the landscape and potentially release stored carbon. Now, what does this have to do with domesticated cattle? Well, it comes back to my point that many of the problems associated with the livestock industry are to do with how we as humans mismanage these poor creatures. There are some people, however, looking beyond the status quo and arguing that cows may hold the key to restoring lost ecosystems and sequestering huge amounts of carbon. The first example I want to look at is from a wildlife biologist called Alan Savory. He gave a fascinating TED Talk back in 2013 where he made the case for what he calls holistic planned grazing of livestock, saying that it can heal land that has been desertified and restore it to a lush grassland ecosystem, which sequesters carbon in the soil. Holistic planned grazing involves managing livestock to mimic the natural predator-prey relationship that I discussed earlier. The basic principle is that instead of allowing a herd of cattle to graze continuously on your entire plot of land, you subdivide the farm up into smaller fields. The animals are then allowed to intensively graze a portion of the farm for a period of time before moving on to the next portion. This allows the soil and vegetation to recover, absorbing carbon as it does. Savory even argues that if you did this on a large enough scale throughout the world, you could bring atmospheric carbon down to pre-industrial levels. Now, this particular claim, as far as I can tell, is unsubstantiated, and other experts think that the actual potential for sequestration is much lower, although still significant. That being said, on the face of it, his methods do seem to create a remarkable transformation of landscapes. If you watch the TED Talk, he shares a number of examples of barren, desertified landscapes that have been transformed into lush green, functioning grasslands. The website for his organisation, the Savory Institute, says that these methods are currently being used on 13 million hectares of land around the world. And there are lots of testimonials from farmers who have had great success in using the holistic planned grazing method. It's a very bold vision, and one that's received both praise and criticism. The TED Talk has received almost 12 million views, between YouTube and the TED website, so this is a fringe idea that has now come into the mainstream. Within the scientific community, there is undoubtedly much skepticism, but there's also more and more hard evidence coming forward to support the idea. A particular study from 2018 by Stanley et al. From Michigan State University and the Union of Concerned Scientists conducted a life cycle assessment comparing greenhouse gas emissions from a typical feedlot cattle farm and a farm that employs a very similar concept to Alan Savory's holistic planned grazing called adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Sometimes people also call this rotational grazing. There's multiple names for what is essentially the same concept. So this is a life cycle assessment, which means it looks at all the emissions relating to cows, including their methane production, farm operations, feed and transportation. The way the results of the study are presented is slightly cryptic for non-scientists, but I'll try to explain it. So basically the assessment measured the kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions equivalent per kilogram of carcass weight. So carbon dioxide equivalent means all greenhouse gases, including methane, but they just express it as if it's all carbon dioxide. This is something scientists do to make it simpler to talk about all emissions at once. And the carcass weight is the weight of the animal after it's been slaughtered. So it seems a bit strange, but that appears to be the standard way of expressing these kind of assessments. So what's important is the result. 1 kilogram of the typical feedlot beef resulted in 6.12 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the beef from the adaptive multi-paddock farm resulted in minus 6.65 kilos of greenhouse gas emissions. So the way the cattle were managed was able to sequester enough carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases within the soil, not only to make the meat carbon neutral, but actually carbon positive. You can imagine that at a large scale over thousands of animals, this really starts to add up and make a significant contribution. The authors of this paper point to 2 other academic studies, both from 2016, that showed even greater sequestration levels on farms in the US. So the scientific evidence for this is definitely growing. And as I said earlier, I mean, there's lots and lots of examples around the world of people doing similar things. It's just that, measuring these things exactly in a scientific way is very difficult. And so that's why we need to look to the few really good quality academic studies that have been done. But let's talk briefly again about methane. I said earlier that cows do emit methane naturally, but it's probably not nearly as big a deal as we've been led to believe. What's more, methane can actually be absorbed into soils and plants when the land is managed properly. So by using these methods, we could create a kind of closed loop system where, yes, methane is emitted into the atmosphere, but eventually it's brought back down to Earth and it's actually consumed by bacteria in the soil, converted to other molecules. So as a quick summary, by raising animals on grasslands in a way that mimics nature, we remove the need to grow crops to feed them, which comprises almost half of livestock's emissions. We have done away with the problems surrounding manure storage and processing because the manure just stays on the land and helps to fertilize the soil. What remains is transport-related emissions and methane from enteric fermentation, but these can be offset entirely by the ability of the soil to sequester greenhouse gases. Plus, the land is absorbing more carbon, making the whole enterprise carbon positive. So there you go. That's why cows are not necessarily evil. I've focused on carbon emissions because I think that is the most compelling aspect of this story, but it's not the only benefit. These livestock management methods I've been talking about essentially recreate a natural grassland ecosystem, and with that they greatly improve biodiversity of plant and animal life and improve soil fertility. As I've spoken about before, we need climate solutions that are multifunctional, that have multiple benefits. And this could be one of them. Not only can we produce high quality food, we can also sequester carbon, improve local biodiversity, and improve soil fertility while having a profitable business model for a local farmer. And this is particularly important on land that has been depleted, degraded, and desertified through years of mismanagement. As Alan Savory says in his TED Talk, this approach has the potential to reclaim land that has been lost to desertification across millions of hectares of land around the world, but particularly in developing nations. Okay, there we go. That is it for this episode. There's obviously tons more information and lots more aspects to this problem of food security, climate change, emissions from agriculture. It's just such a big topic. But I decided to focus on this aspect that I find really, really interesting, and I think just adds a bit of nuance to this conversation that, to be an environmentalist, you need to stop eating meat or you need to eat less meat. There might be a way that we can produce meat in a better way, a way that's better for the planet. I know this topic maybe seems a little bit strange for an urban designer like me to be talking about. I'm totally open to getting feedback on this. If you think I've misrepresented anything or there's something else I should read into, always message me on Twitter, Instagram, or by email. All the details are in the podcast description. I love hearing from people, and I'm always happy to be proved wrong if I've said something wrong in a podcast. But beyond that, I hope you've enjoyed this. There's lots more episodes coming over the next coming weeks and months. As usual, please follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And something that can really, really help out the podcast is, if you enjoy it, just tell someone about it. Tell a friend or a colleague that you know is interested in these topics about the podcast. Send them an episode. It really, really helps to spread the word and to grow the listenership. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.